For Macron, 2017 would say things like, there is no French culture. He would say all those comments which made him sound like a Tony Blair 2.0. Over the past years, there's been a remarkable transformation. Now, obviously, his pivot from a kind of a more centre-left candidate to a centre-right president on economic is kind of well known. But what is much more remarkable is his pivot on immigration and kind of cultural malaise that Zemmour has been bringing up over the past decade.
Well, welcome to another bonus episode of Uncommon Decency. This week, I thought we'd start by addressing the campaign event that Valérie Pécresse held over the weekend. François, what can you tell us? What was she there to say, and what is Valérie Pécresse campaigning on?
This was a very important meeting. She held it in Paris, in le Zénith de Paris, which is a very big room. It's important for her because her campaign has not been doing very well. It's important because this is her first major rally in which she needs to show there is some energy around her campaign, there is some enthusiasm, and more importantly, that she has what it takes to become the next president of France. And she's not been doing so well because I'm not sure if you remember, but when we recorded one of our previous bonus episodes, after she had been picked as the centre-right leader by the Les Républicains membership, she got a massive bump in polls. She went from the low teens to the high teens, even approaching 20%. And some polls were starting to say, well, actually, she has a pretty good shot against Macron in a runoff. So that really boosted her campaign in December into January. But now it feels like she is not capable of setting her themes, of defending her ideas. So this rally was very important because internal criticisms were becoming very strong. Increasingly, there's a lot of media attention on the few Les Républicains figures who left Les Républicains to join Eric Zemmour, such as Guillaume Pelletier, who used to be the number 2 of the party only a few months ago. So she needed to quell that distress within the party. And so before I kind of judge the whole thing, I thought it's quite interesting to read what she has focused her campaign on. So she says, and this is a rough translation, she defends the France of cathedrals, the France of Charles Péguy and of Marie Curie. France is also a pavé de Charolais, which is a beef, with some good wine. France is currently at a crossroad. There is no fatality, neither for the Great Replacement nor for the Great Déclassement, the great economic déclassement. How could I say déclassement?
Downturn or the
loss of status, the great loss of status, essentially. And so she defended a policy of 0 visas for all the countries who refuse to take back their illegals in France. And she is threatening to stop any of granting any visas to those countries. She says, I want a nation that does not break in silence. I defend assimilation because I want to make French citizens of heart and not French citizens of paper. So it's a pretty muscular debate. But however, what became quite apparent is she wasn't rhetorically doing very well. She was reading her prompter. It seemed like a very lackadaisical meeting. And so she needed to do this because until a few weeks ago, she wasn't confident she'd be able to fill up one of those rallies, and she feared that she might, the comparison with Zemmour would be unkind to her. And I'm not sure this rally will be the one that is able of bolstering her campaign. She's not able of setting her agenda, setting her themes for the campaign. And yeah, it's a tough situation. Julian, I thought you had something interesting to say about she had a recent Financial Times interview, which I think might be interesting as well for this conversation.
Yes, and it's a very good contrast with what she said earlier today at the rally, where in that sense, she's speaking to a popular audience and stressing immigration and attempting to adopt that harder line. In her conversation with the Financial Times, she returned to what we consider traditional conservative talking points on the economy. promising a return to fiscal discipline. She attempted to link the rhetoric on immigration to efforts to balance the budget, to lower the welfare bill, and other more traditional arguments that conservative figures have made in the past when pushing for a lower immigration number or a tougher immigration policy. She did stress some of those limits on migrants and tougher stances on asylum seekers, but the point of emphasis was more on the economy than it was on immigration, which underscores the point that we said when Pécresse became the nominee, that she has to straddle this divide of being the traditional center-right figure who talks about economic discipline whilst also trying to court the elements further to the right who want to talk about cultural decline and the negative effects of immigration on France's culture and society.
Yeah, but this is so interesting. This contrast between some of her some of the comments she made, or some of the things he said at that speech this weekend. The contrast between that and the more kind of economically neoliberal message that she conveyed to the Financial Times, which I think it kind of goes with the territory and the kind of paper that the Financial Times is. But what you're really getting at there, Julian, is the two faces of the French right? You've got the hardcore nationalist kind of socially conservative segment of French conservatism, and then you've got the economically neoliberal segment of conservatism, who was, I think, best embodied by François Fillon, who was a very rightist, but he was economically rightist. He was called a Thatcherite by the French press, and I just think it's so interesting what François was saying at the beginning too, because because you quoted her as saying France is the country of cathedrals. Well, that's another kind of talking point of François-Xavier Bellamy in the European Parliament. He says, les bâtisseurs de cathédrales. We have to get back to a society that wants to build cathedrals. And so it's a really it's a fluid combination between the traditionalist and the neoliberal strains of French conservatism.
On a lighter note, it makes me think of a great moment in Yes Minister. So for those of you who haven't watched a fantastic Yes Minister, it's a TV show based in the 1980s in the UK, in the UK government. And there's a great moment about the press. And you have to know your audience. This is essentially what is happening. And the quote is, "I know exactly who reads the press. The Daily Mirror is read by people who think they run the country. The Guardian is read by people who actually think they ought to run the country. The Times is read by the people who actually do run the country. The Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people who run the country. The Financial Times is read by people who own the country. The Morning Star is read by people who think the country ought to be run by another country, aka Russia. The Daily Telegraph is read by people who think it is run by another country. And the Sun readers don't really care who runs the country, as long as she's got big tits." So that's a British press for you. So there's some extent there's a lot of that going on. She's talking to a different audience here. But something which I find really interesting is this double conversation she's having with two different audiences talks about something we mentioned here, which is her having to straddle both demographics to some extent. Because what I find is really interesting in this campaign is, if you read the meeting, to some extent, it could have been plucked out of a Zemmour video or something. She would sound like Zemmour in some aspects. And that is exactly what Macron and his allies have been saying over the past few weeks, is Pécresse is aping Zemmour. But at the same time, and I think that's something which is probably more dangerous for her electorally, is the fact a lot of right-wing voters probably suspect she's not a true believer. They probably suspect that she only says that for the election, and once in office, she will run as a centrist. So I think that is much more powerful electorally, because within the Républicains, there is a huge chunk of the electorate of people who are sympathetic to Zemmour, who think Zemmour actually speaks like them and says the things that need to be said, and has been saying them for a very long time. I think something that is much more threatening to Pécresse isn't so much the accusation of, no, she's another Zemmour, which I don't think will be that convincing. I think the much more difficult threat for her is the accusation of her being insincere, that she's talking a big right-wing game right now, but if she makes it to office, she will actually enact those ideas. And that's an accusation that has been lingering on the French right for a very long time. People, especially with Jacques Chirac, who was known to be a bit of a populist in campaigns and much more of a centrist in government. So that's something that people will, I think, follow quite closely, especially because there is a lot of sympathy to Zemmour, at least Zemmour the intellectual, maybe not Zemmour the politician. And it's going to be interesting to see how she manages to placate that electorate. But she can't simply ape Zemmour or anything like that. I think she needs to set her agenda on the election a lot more. She needs to create her own words, her own agenda, her own policies, because right now it feels like she's simply placating her right wing by copying Zemmour. And at some point, people will say, well, we'd rather get the original rather than the copy.
Yeah, but one thing that I find so telling in the report or relationship between Zemmour and Pécresse is that Zemmour is a very interesting candidate in that he appeals. He essentially says, he said it in an interview with it that and which I think it really kind of reflects a big pillar of his thought. He said, I was enthused by certain politicians of the RPR, like Pasqua or Séguin. I thought that they could do great things for the country. But then along came Jacques Chirac, and he sold the country off to the centrists, which you could almost even argue that goes all the way back to Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. But Chirac was also a big kind of centrist. He was one of the more centrist leaders in the party, right? So there's that really interesting relationship where Zemmour says, the RPR had great ideas, was a great party for a while, but then it essentially got corrupt, where it got corrupted by the influence of the centrists. And I want to appeal to an electorate that would have voted for the RPR in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, Julian.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comparison to admittedly on the other side of the political spectrum and also on the other side of the Atlantic. But the way Pécresse is attempting to satisfy both those voices reminds me of a lot of the efforts of Democrats in 2020 to try and satisfy the Sanders wing, even though many of those voters weren't traditional Democrats, in a bid to try and win the Democratic nomination. And ultimately, many of the pretenders to that progressive crown couldn't do it because they weren't the real thing. They weren't the authentic progressive. And one example that springs immediately to mind is the current vice president, Kamala Harris, who, it's not particularly relevant to the details, but she made a pledge to get rid of private health insurance, which is a Bernie Sanders policy. And she did it in order to appeal to that wing. But because it wasn't her brand as a politician, it wasn't who she had been as a politician, it came off as insincere and she had to backtrack a few days later. And I just wonder if there's a similar lesson for Pécresse in attempting to reach out to those voters that haven't traditionally been voters that she would go after in her previous iterations as a politician. She's almost betraying her own brand in attempting to be something she isn't, because she sees the momentum behind the anti-immigration voices, the anti-immigration policies, believes that that's what she has to do. And I mean, to a certain extent, looking back at the primaries, it's very clear that there is a large percentage of that Republican Party that would like to see that, but she isn't the right messenger for it.
Well, one way in which the comparison breaks down, which is why it might have worked with Biden but not with Pécresse, is what the big glue for Biden was Trump. Trump was such a kind of reprehensible figure for the left. He kind of concentrated everything that they detested about the right. But it was really easy to paper over those differences and create kind of a large tent. The issue is it doesn't work that well with Macron. Some people really hate Macron, don't get me wrong. But he's not that far away. He's not Mélenchon. He's not kind of the total opposite to Pécresse or to Zemmour. So it's not as easy to build a large tent. And also, it's a two-party system, so you have to choose, choose the lesser evil. In France, it's like a big supermarket. You've got plenty of options. You don't have to take this product. You've got 15 different, you don't have to take le beurre président. You can take le beurre from Brittany. You can take le beurre from something. But, there's 115 different brands of butter you can take. Whereas in America, you have to choose between two types of butter. And if you don't like this one, well, you have to take the other one. There's no free options, essentially. Yeah. Sorry, I'm hungry. That's why I've been talking about butter too much.
Yeah. But this is getting into what I would call as a leitmotif of this podcast, really a running theme across several of our bonus episodes, particularly. But it's this trend which you remark upon, François, in a recent essay that you wrote for Palladium. But this trend in France towards Zemmourization, right? This sort of like shift to the right of the French electorate, right? And you're saying that Pécresse needs to differentiate herself from Zemmour in order to build a campaign of her own. But you remember when we covered Michel Barnier's run for primary run, one of the big things he pledged to do was also to put a moratorium on immigration. So that tells you a lot about really the radicalization of even parts of the French center right.
Yeah, it's a piece I've been working on for a long time. I actually started writing some of it in I think late November, and it got published in early February by Palladium. So the link should be down below in the description. So if you want to give a look to it, I thought what was quite striking is you compare Macron of 2017 with Macron of 2022. I think that was my starting point that led me to write this article. The Macron of 2017 would say things like, there is no French culture. There are many cultures in France, or the cultures in France are diverse, but there's no French culture. He would also say stuff like, Angela Merkel saved the collective dignity of France by welcoming more than 1 million refugees into Germany. Sorry, the collective dignity of Europe. He would say all those comments which made him sound like a Tony Blair 2.0. And over the past years, there's been a remarkable transformation. Now, obviously, his pivot from a kind of a more center-left candidate to a center-right president on economics is kind of well known. Many of the left-wing economists who advised him in 2017 have since shared their disappointment. We should actually have one of those left-wing economists on the show soon. So we might be able to ask him a few things about that. But that kind of shift on economics hasn't been that surprising. And I think, most left-wing voters who voted for him in the runoff against Le Pen kind of saw that coming. But what is much more remarkable is his pivot on immigration and kind of cultural malaise that Zemmour has been bringing up over the past decade or so. It started in 2018 when he passed this new bill on immigration. And his Minister of the Interior back then, Gérard Collomb, said some truly remarkable things. He said, we are being submerged by asylum seekers. And he rhetorically asked whether France could build a medium-sized city every year to accommodate these refugees. When Collomb resigned in 2019, he said, today we live side by side, but I fear tomorrow we might live face to face. During the parliamentary debates over his immigration bill, he said the situation over immigration could become irreversible within 5 to 6 years, dreading a secession or a partition.
Which sorry to interject, but which is a big campaign theme of Zemmour. Yeah. He says that we are in the short window of time where we can still act to revert and roll back the changes that have been wreaking havoc in French society over the past few decades.
Yeah.
And that, if we let another 2 decades lapse, then it will be too late.
It's too late. So this is Macron's former Minister of Interior. So you might say, so what? He got a muscular Minister of Interior. That's what ministers of the Interior always do. But then when you see what Macron himself has been saying, he also denounced a creeping secession. and he has been really ramping up a campaign against le sécessionnisme, secession. And he gave an interview to Valeurs Actuelles, which is a right-wing to far-right publication, in which he said, "We need to expel all the people who don't belong here." And while he criticized Zemmour's deadly dialectic, he seems to suggest he can't speak like Zemmour because we would be heading towards a civil war. And then something else which is more debatable, but it's something a left-wing journalist who's the author of two pretty well-acclaimed biographies of Macron. So this journalist called Marc Indeveld gave an interview in which he says that Macron on those issues thinks exactly like Valeurs Actuelles, a far-right publication, in that apparently in private he uses the term great replacement and is obsessed with the idea. Now, it's hard to say because he's only mentioned that in this one interview and says he got that from aides within the Élysée. But no one has confirmed nor denied that allegation. But it kind of shows how those ideas have been creeping into the Macronist worldview. And there was a remarkable poll, actually, that was published in November, in which they asked people what they thought about the concept of great replacement. Now, no, the great replacement is not kind of a benign term. It is loaded. It is very, very loaded. It was made up by this far-right intellectual. And it's the idea that the elites are helping a replacement of the host population with arrival of foreigners. This is not a benign concept. Only like a few months ago, Marine Le Pen would have never used that word. And so this poll said that 67% of the French population dreaded the arrival of a potential correct replacement. And that included a majority of Macron supporters. So people say, this Zemmour is is representing this new right-wing surge, and yes, that is true. But he's still unlikely to become the next president. What is much more remarkable is to see how Zemmourized the French political landscape has been on those ideas.
Yeah,
and it's an amazing contrast looking back on the last election campaign, the extent to which the Macron of that year wouldn't recognize the Macron today, and how Zemmour has totally refashioned the political debate on not just half of the political spectrum, because I believe that, as we've spoken about before, if you look at the polls and look at right-wing candidates compared to left-wing candidates, it is a substantial segment of the population that is in that right-wing camp. And Zemmour is setting the terms of debate from an ideological perspective, in terms of the rhetoric that's used, and the fact that the great replacement theory is being mentioned by all these prominent candidates on the right is something that would shock people who have not been following French politics for the last few years.
But even French people who had not been following French politics for the last few years would have been, I think like 5 years ago, if you asked people what they thought of the great replacement theory, they probably wouldn't have heard about it, or probably would have been kind of instinctively a bit suspicious. I want to push back a little bit on the idea that it is Zemmour who has been shifting the landscape on his own. There is a question of supply and demand here. France is a country that has been rocked by terrorist attacks in 2015, in 2016, in 2017, less so nowadays. But recently, people remember the assassination of Samuel Paty, this French professor who got decapitated for showing a cartoon of Mohammed in a class on religion and freedom of speech. So it's definitely something that's been creeping over the past decade. Whether Zemmour popularized those ideas, or whether Zemmour became a popular figure because those ideas felt like they represented a reality that people saw on a day-to-day basis, is an open question. But it's undeniable, some of the ideas, like we were talking about it with Pécresse. Pécresse says, we want zero visas to countries who refuse to take their illegals. This is actually something Macron has been trying to do with Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia of late. But this is remarkable. I don't think anyone ever used that kind of weapon over the past decade in politics or so. I think this is a remarkable shift in rhetoric and in policy.
Yeah, but I think which is really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, of the three countries you've mentioned, the one that is demographically bigger, just in terms of the immigration that flows from it towards France, is Algeria, right? By far. I mean, Morocco and Tunisia are smaller countries, and we were just as we were discussing, off the record, I remember Zemmour made a big announcement about this idea you've just mentioned of strong arming Algeria into accepting its illegal immigrants who reside in France illegally, but that can't return because Algeria won't take them. And I think part of it, I kind of place that concern that Zemmour expressed in the larger background of all the things he has said on Algeria, because I think you have to, in order to really fully understand Zemmour as a political character, you have to understand his Pied Noir roots, right? And he's also lambasted Algeria's ruling class for being for living off of what he calls his memorial rent seeking, la rente mémorielle, right? He essentially argues that Algeria, the Algerian regime is essentially living on because it tells Algerians the lie that France is guilty for everything that happens to Algeria, right?
Yeah. Do you want to go?
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in there. To your point on Zemmour not quite really setting or not being the one that's the main driver, and some of it is event driven, and he's reacting to that. I would say that the facts that we talk about Zemmour, his ascent in the polls, and the fact that he's still continuing to secure these defections from Rassemblement National. I cannot remember the name of the person who defected only today from Marine Le Pen to support Mr. Zemmour. Stéphane Ravier, I believe.
Yeah. That one was quite obvious.
It's been coming.
It was going to happen. Yeah.
I think most dramatically, I'm not sure if we covered it last time. I don't know if it had happened, but Marion Maréchal Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's niece, also saying Zemmour was a better candidate. He's been able to capture the winds of French politics in a truly exceptional manner. And I think the fact that we're seeing Pécresse, we're seeing Macron adopt these lines. Macron obviously has been doing it since before Zemmour announced he was running for president. But it feels like the reaction is more to the threat posed by Zemmour than it is to Le Pen. And that he really is the leading voice when it comes to pushing these ideas around the future of France being at risk from immigration and the need for a sort of cultural reset to preserve the France that he knows.
Yeah. And I want to take a step back from the whole thing, because currently I'm looking at Politico's poll of polls on the French election, which is a poll aggregator. Macron is at 25%. And then you get Le Pen at 17%, Pécresse at 15%, Zemmour at 14%. So Zemmour is fourth. Currently, he's not going to be in the runoff. It could change. There's been a bit of a momentum of the past few days, I think, for Zemmour after a very long stagnation. But currently, despite all the defections, despite Le Pen is essentially running her campaign on her own, she's still at 17%. That's still very strong. She has built a kind of long-term partnership with a lot of the working class who really see her as their defender. And I think they might still be a little bit suspicious of Zemmour. I think they might kind of instinctively associate with some of Zemmour's ideas, but they also, might suspect he would kind of throw them away for in the name of great capital, something along those lines. And that's something I don't think Zemmour has been able to change in the past few weeks. But what that means, though, is a 17 to 14% gap between Le Pen and Zemmour means it's basically in the margin of error. We could have very different runoff scenarios. We could have Macron against Le Pen, Macron against Pécresse, Macron against Zemmour. And also, it could still happen, Mélenchon is at 10%. 10% is not great, but in the current situation, you probably only need 16, 17, maybe 18% to make it to the runoff. So if Mélenchon plays it well, if he managed to ease up the left, essentially, and do what he did in 2017, where he essentially sucked off all the electorate of socialists. He could be a surprise runoff candidate against Macron. I don't think we should write him off. He's a good campaigner. He's shown it before. So yeah, it could be incredibly tight. I could really see Mélenchon going up in the next few weeks and tightening the electorate. I don't see Taubira, one of the left-wing candidates, making a break. Hidalgo currently is polling under the Communist Party candidate. So I don't think there's much to hope there. But I think Mélenchon could. Now the issue they have is if they make it to runoff against anyone, they're not going to make it because again, as we talked, the what's left of the left is just so weak that they can't win the presidency. I think that it's a very depressing state for the French left actually, but it's hard to see how they could win it. But again, it's hard to see how Zemmour could win it. At this point, it's hard to see how Macron cannot win it, does not win this. So yeah, I think it's a word of caution. We talk about Zemmorisation, and I think it's undeniable it has shifted. French politics have shifted quite dramatically in the past 5 years. But in the end, we might still go with the centre-right candidate.
So he may lose the battle, but he in the end, he's won the war because we're talking about the issues that he wants to talk about.
Yeah, but I think he would like to talk about something else than immigration and identity. I think he wants to talk about Europe. France currently has the presidency of the European Council, so the rotating presidency of the European Council. So he'll probably want to talk about that. He'll probably want to talk about industrial sovereignty and stuff like that. But again, even the stuff on industrial sovereignty and nuclear power, this is a pretty recent conversion of Macron. He wasn't huge on proto-protectionism, because I don't think you'll call it protectionism. It's a form of European protectionism. He wasn't very fond of that back in 2017. And he wasn't fond of nuclear back then. He said we need to phase out of nuclear, and he actually shut a lot of the nuclear facilities. Now he has a change of heart because he realizes nuclear is quite central, especially if we were serious about our green credentials. So yeah, he's changed a lot.
Yeah, and obviously a big part of this whole trend that you're describing and that you elaborate on in the essay, this trend of Zemmourisation, I think has another element to it, which is that Macron himself sort of ran as a centrist candidate coming from the Socialist Party, so obviously a left
Blairist.
A Blairist, exactly, a Blairist. And he's now governing on several issues. You were mentioning some of his rhetoric on immigration, but he's also governed on some issues domestically as a tough sort of you were talking about Gérard Collomb earlier.
Yeah.
But even Macron himself, I think, with his law on separatism, was and the media understood it as such, that he was trying to appeal to a right wing electorate. So even Macron is included in this trend.
Yeah, for sure. So let's wrap this up. I think we probably will have another at least one on the French election because that's something we're following quite closely here. But I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine. Because the episode is called Zemmourist France, Bonapartist Macron. And there's one front on which Macron has been Bonapartist is in the energy he's put on the diplomatic front. He's been meeting in Romania with Putin, with calling Zelensky, calling with the Germans. And he's been trying to set up all those different meetings. There was a 2-hour meeting between Putin this Saturday. Which is just huge. And obviously everyone saw the meme with Macron and Putin sitting in this very, very large table. So I guess when Putin says all the options are on the table, he needs a very, very big table because there's a lot of options apparently. And so, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you can talk about for 2 hours with Putin. I think it must be quite daunting given how tense the situation must be. But there's something which has been interesting, which is, if you remember what happened last summer in Afghanistan, France actually evacuated all of its citizens and allies very early on. I think late July, early August. And the Americans said, no, don't worry, you can stay. because the Americans thought, the situation wasn't as bad as the French thought. And they also believe that by doing so, you'd be only undermining the young Afghan Republic. And so France decided to leave early, and in the end, it was vindicated because obviously the situation was untenable. But what is interesting is in this situation, America, the United States, and the United Kingdom actually have been calling their citizens to leave Ukraine, believing an invasion was potentially imminent. And France actually has been saying the opposite. France has been saying the situation is tense, but I don't think an invasion is imminent. So it's going to be interesting to see if the French get it right this time again. But it shows, I think, this kind of activism shows that Macron really, really wants to have a big diplomatic win. And I think he believes he can play this kind of François Hollandian role of being an intermediary between Europeans and Russia. And believing that if you talk with him long enough, you'll be able to have a diplomatic breakthrough. I think a lot of people believe his activism is useful. It's better than nothing. The question is, will it deliver? It's very unclear. Julian?
Just yes, on the point of the US and the UK, this is actually quite an interesting thing. I know we're going to talk about Europe, but it's a very interesting use of intelligence that you have. There's an article David Sanger in the New York Times talked about this, how essentially it's preemptive use of intelligence or to try and stop something from happening. So, for instance, the British saying that there's a Russian plan to install a puppet regime is an attempt to stop the Russians from doing that, because then if it happens, the British can say, see, we told you.
Yeah.
So it's a rather unique use of intelligence that in some ways might work, it might not. It's not really been done before by either the US or the UK in this manner. But it's an attempt to sort of preempt and counter the Russian disinformation efforts across the border. Just moving on to the actual diplomacy.
The reverse wishful effect.
The reverse, yes. In terms of the diplomacy, it's been quite interesting. Obviously, I'm sitting here in Washington, and people have been talking about this for weeks on end now. To see the different energies of European leaders, the old line from, I think it's Kissinger, of when I want to call Europe, who do I call? Yeah. Because there is no single leader. And although France has the rotating presidency right now, you would expect Joseph Borrell as High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, or von der Leyen maybe to take an active role in this, but it's Macron of France taking an active role. Engagement with Russia is something that he has been pushing for several years. And then, similarly enough, and you could argue that there is a domestic element to this, the British, both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, the new Foreign Secretary, meeting with their Russian counterparts to try and establish a British voice and a British perspective, even though the UK is not party to the Minsk agreement. And then silent amidst all of this is, of course, the Germans, for reasons that we've discussed in the past and probably will again. Macron's energy and activism on flying first to Moscow and then to Kiev to meet with Putin and Zelensky, and also conferring with other leaders in Europe.
Yeah, Romania.
Yeah, it's exactly what the continent needs. And I understand the frustration from his perspective that the pending conflict, shall we say, in Ukraine, as well as the active conflict in Ukraine, has been turned into a US versus Russia issue, which some security analysts point out makes a chance of miscalculation and indeed war more likely. Because if you bring the US into the picture, Russia feels more threatened than if it's just an isolated European incident. So Macron's diplomacy to try and put that European voice, and he did confer with the US and NATO before these meetings, is actually potentially at least a positive attempt to put Europe back at the heart of the diplomatic negotiations and de-escalate by removing the specter of American involvement.
Yeah, and if you want to be, because there's been a lot of accusations thrown around, because Macron mentioned the possibility of Finlandization of Ukraine, essentially making Ukraine a kind of neutral zone politically, which was roughly the status that Finland had during the Cold War. Now, obviously, it is a loaded term, and a lot of people in Ukraine resent it because they feel that they're being abandoned, and yada yada yada. But so there's been a lot of pushback from the blob, the American foreign policy establishment, of Macron is trying to sell off Ukraine, and obviously whenever you talk about foreign policy, there's two comparisons in foreign policy that you always get. One is Vietnam. Oh, we're creeping, and we're getting bogged down, and it's becoming Vietnam all over again. And the other one is Munich.
Yes, the Munich conference. I was going to say.
Yeah, it's either Vietnam or Munich. There's nothing in between. But it's all foreign policy, folks. Don't bother studying foreign policy. It's either Vietnam or Munich. And so essentially, Macron is now being accused of being a mini-choix, of being ready to abandon Ukraine to the appetite of Russia. Maybe that's true. Maybe that is. Maybe Macron says, Ukraine unfortunately has not been granted a generous geography and has to deal with the fact it is going to be surrounded by a monstrous power to its east. But maybe, just maybe, what Macron is doing isn't completely uncoordinated with the rest of NATO. Maybe, just maybe, it's quite useful to have a kind of bit of a loose cannon who's throwing ideas. Doesn't have to go anywhere, but it allows America to have someone pushing that idea without them having to do it themselves. So maybe that's an option. So, you have to be realistic. Ukraine is on the border of Russia. Ukraine is never going to enter NATO formally, but the ties have been deepening with the West over the past years. And the United States would have been equally uneasy if, let's say, China had been growing ties with Mexico over the past few years. So, unfortunately for Ukraine, they have been gifted a terrible geography to guarantee their entire sovereignty is protected.
Yeah, and it's what's really interesting about this whole issue of Ukraine is that it's also kind of drawing a wedge within the American right. Right, it's really interesting. You mentioned, the people of Ukraine, because ultimately, what we care about as Europeans is that the path to become a member state of the EU is open to any nation that wants to do that. But in the American right, there's this wedge that's being drawn with the kind of war hawks, who are essentially another iteration of neoconservatism, right? Irving Kristol's neoconservatism from the 1970s, and these were mostly former communists who would become conservative and who ended up having a very sort of liberal internationalist view of foreign policy, but it's really interesting that this issue of Ukraine is driving this wedge within the American right, where you have kind of some of the new voices in the realigned Republican Party are now saying, "Hey, look, we're still being infiltrated essentially by these war hawks, and we need to, the Republican Party is no longer going to be the party of endless wars, and we shouldn't get involved in Ukraine. Ukraine is too far away, and ultimately, NATO has overextended." Right. So, so it's like different political families in different countries are reacting to this differently.
Yeah. So I think let's wrap this up by asking each and one of you if you think there's going to be a invasion in the next few weeks. Let's start with Julian.
Oh wow, we've got to make predictions. The one thing I was hoping wouldn't happen. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna answer it by being slightly flippant and saying, well, there technically already is an invasion. It will just be continuation of that to secure the buffer in the eastern Ukraine. I don't think we're going to see a march on Kiev. I think it's just they'll fully annex the segments of eastern Ukraine that have been under civil war to link up that part with Crimea and Russia.
Okay. Jorge?
Well, you know what? I don't think there's going to be a march on Kiev either, but I think there is going to be an effort to prevent Ukraine from sliding west by military means from Russia. I think that Russia has very clearly indicated that it has the willingness and the ability to mobilize militarily to stop that outcome from ever happening.
So
yeah, sorry, François.
No, go ahead.
Your prediction, then I'll come back.
No. Go ahead. Mine is very long, so go ahead.
Okay, there's one. My last comparison of the day, I promise. Last year, or sorry, maybe was it last year? Or maybe it was the year before, when Azerbaijan and Armenia went to war again over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azeri success prompted mass demonstrations and almost assassination attempts on the Armenian prime minister, and destabilized the government there. And he won't get re-elected. Pashana, he might even already resigned. It's been a while since I checked in on Armenian politics. I think you could see a similar situation for Zelensky. If Russia enjoys military success and is able to take that eastern part of the country, there'll be political pressure. Zelensky is battling a lot of people within his own government. Obviously, tackling corruption was supposed to be the main calling card, and he still faces a lot of pressure to do that. A limited invasion could serve as the political end that Putin wants, without necessarily having to commit the resources you'd need for a full-scale march to Kiev.
So I'm of two minds of this. I'm going to pick one side at the end, but I think I'm in two minds, because on the one hand, it seems that rationally it is not cost effective for Russia to go on a full-on kind of proper occupation of Ukraine, because I don't think they can hold Ukraine. It'd just be so expensive, so difficult, and also the kind of political costs would be huge, and it's very unusual compared to previous Russian interventions, which have been quite cheap and quite low key. The support in Syria, the mercenaries in Libya, even the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was quite short-lived, and they didn't go to Tbilisi. They just crushed the Georgian defenses and went back. So I think if we do see an invasion, it'd be something kind of on a smaller scale. But I think the risk is we've reached a point where people say, Putin is bluffing. That is kind of counterfactual, saying he's not going to invade, he's bluffing. And for the bluff to be credible, he needs to invest a lot of resources. But the issue with that theory is he needs to get something out of this. Because if he backs down, it is a proper humiliation. He's been massing up 120,000 troops. He's been putting armies all across Ukraine's frontiers. It's been going on for 2 months. And basically, what has Putin gotten from the West so far? Basically, no permanent troop build-up in Ukraine. Some willingness to discuss bomber flights and intermediate range missiles. I mean, this is not a big win. None of this seems very stable, permanent, and it's going to be hard for him to come back to Russia saying, "Hey, great win! We didn't invade. We just got great concessions." So he's reached a point where I think he kind of is in a situation where he needs larger concessions for him to work. And now the invasion might not take the form of invasion; might be kind of massive cyber attacks, propaganda campaigns. Maybe even supporting some kind of coup, as Julian talked about earlier. But I think at this point it seems that we're pointing towards some kind of intervention from Russia against the Ukraine. Maybe not a proper invasion or something, but Putin needs a win, I think.
Well, it can only go in one of three ways, right? One of us will be right. It's we've got different predictions here, and all are likely in their own way, and these are very uncertain times.
Yeah, and then next week we discover that Zemmour flies into Moscow and says, "Don't invade Ukraine," and big kumbaya, and it doesn't happen.
And then he becomes president of France.
Sorry?
Then he becomes president of France.
He becomes president of France because Putin supports a Zemmourist coup, and he becomes the president of France.
Let me try, François. Let me try to wed the two issues we've discussed today together, and ask you the following: is Zemmour as Russia friendly as Marine Le Pen has always been, or is he? Where does he stand?
I suspect Zemmour is more Russia friendly intellectually than Marine Le Pen. Unfortunately, Marine Le Pen had some Russian bankers, so she's not in a great position to say anything tough against Russia. I suspect Zemmour kind of intellectually is very much turned towards Russia for different reasons, because of Christianity, because of the opposition to Islamism, because of some kind of vision of realpolitik. For all these reasons, I think and because he's very suspicious of the Americans and so on and so on. I think Le Pen quite simply doesn't have much of a choice because she, for most of her political career, depended on Russian banks because she wasn't able to get any loans from French banks. So I don't think she can afford to antagonize her banker.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's but what I've heard though, and from on the other side of the story, is that the reason she had to go to these Russian bankers is because the French ones wouldn't lend her money, wouldn't lend her campaign money. So, to me, I mean, the fact that she is kind of tethered to the Russian financial system, I think it happened by default. I mean, by
No, I don't think she wanted to. I think she could have gotten money from a French bank. She would have done that for sure. I agree. I think it's giving Russia an increased leverage on French politics by making sure that only Russian banks will be willing to give money to a French political candidate, one that reached for a runoff in 2017. I think that's a bit of a political own goal, if you want to ask me.
Yeah.
So I think we can wrap it up. Thanks a lot, Julian, for coming back on the show. I want to thank you, Jorge, but you are contractually obliged to come here every week. So a weaker thank you to you, and a strong thank you to all our listeners who have endured our terrible historical comparisons and our terrible yes minister jokes. Thank you so much for enduring with us. Special thanks to our wonderful patrons who have allowed us to do some fantastic stuff, some fantastic episodes, to create this structure we now have. And we've got plenty of great projects. We are looking to update our digital and physical equipment. So if you want to help us, please join the uncommonly decent army of patrons we have. You'd be very, very much appreciated. If you can't afford that, don't worry. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts. These are very useful. You can subscribe on Spotify. You can share the show with a friend the good old-fashioned way. And thank you so much. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jorge. And
thank you,
all of our listeners. I say see you.